Well, what about these two?
Oh, they suck.
These are the same two movies. You weren't paying any attention.
No, I wasn't.
I don't think your manager would appreciate
I don't
it.
appreciate your ruse, ma'am.
I beg your pardon?
Your ruse, your cunning attempt to trick me.
I was only pointing out that you weren't paying any attention to what I was saying.
I hope it feels good.
You hope what feels good?
I hope it feels so good to be right. There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
We've all made bad decisions. I've been there. You've certainly been there. You, in the back, you live there. We've all had terrible decisions within our drafts. None of us are certified draft professionals. So what I'm going to do is point out the worst fantasy picks within each round of the draft. But I'm not running through every round of the draft, just the first 10 picks. So the first 10 picks of the draft, the worst selections, in my opinion, is what you're about to hear. And the very first round comes to no surprise to anyone, because outside of injuries, I'm not emphasizing too much on injuries, because I don't think an injury is a sign that you picked a bad selection or that you picked a bad player. An injury is an injury unless, of course, you selected a player that has a history of injuries, and that is why I chose to go with Jonathan Taylor, because he did not have a history of injuries, and he, of course, was injured several games in this fantasy season. However, injuries wasn't what totally fucked the season up for him. It was just coaching and where the Indianapolis Colts decided to go the very first 5 to 6 games of the season. He got 23 the very first week, then 5, 9, 2, injury, 7, 5. After that, I believe the coach was fired. Jeff Saturday takes over, then 21, 13, 15, 10. It seems like Jonathan Taylor is back to being Jonathan Taylor, but this was the demise of my fantasy season right here, because if I would have selected Christian McCaffrey, who was my other choice, I was not thinking of picking up Derrick Henry, I would have had a very different fantasy season. The injuries within this round, of course, to note, are Joe's terrible, horrible injury that he experienced with Cooper Kupp. But again, my selection was the worst of round 1. Round 2, the worst horrible selection was made by Hensel with Javonte Williams, who we all knew was going to be in some sort of a timeshare with Melvin Gordon. We all knew that was going to happen, but what we didn't know is that this young guy would, of course, get hurt within the first month of the season. But going into it, it was already trending in a certain direction. 8 week 1, 8 week 2, 5, and then 2. And you could only assume that with the Broncos defense, it was going to go in a horrible theme of low scores for Hensel. So even though I'm not emphasizing on injuries, I will say that everyone pretty much knew that picking up a Denver running back specifically was a complete disaster. We all thought that Russell Wilson and Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton, we all thought that they would be amongst the best wide receiver and quarterback combinations in the fantasy league. That, of course, was not the case. But Javonte Williams is the worst selection. The third round goes to Cam Akers, and that is to no surprise to Andy, who knows what Cam Akers wasn't able to do. He sucked dick this year. He came back. He scored 18 points week 13. No one cares. He scored 8 points last week. He is the most disappointing selection of the of the third round. The fourth round of this fantasy year was none other than Kyle Pitts, who was selected by Hensel. Kyle Pitts is a player going on to the next fantasy season. I would still be open to selecting him. There would have to be a quarterback change, or he would have to be in another team. I don't know what his situation is. I know he's a young player, but there would have to be a different situation in Atlanta for me to show interest, because this is they laid it out for you this season as far as his targets. He's got like 2 catches week 1, 2, 5, 1, injury, 3, 5. Just not enough targets, not enough red zone opportunities, I would assume, because I don't know any running backs for the Atlanta Falcons this year. And of course, Marcus Mariota is an evolved form of a Johnny Manziel, or maybe a Baker Mayfield. More of a versatile, stronger arm than a Jimmy Garoppolo, a competent player, but somebody whom you would never take seriously for fantasy. Maybe he can run in the end zone a couple of times, but he's a piece of shit for the most part. No real targets here. Nothing else more to say other than you look forward to next season, where you would assume that Kyle Pitts, who I believe was injured, was he? Did he eventually get injured? Week 11 he got injured, so he hasn't played in several weeks. I don't think he's going to play for the rest of the season. There's probably no point in a young player like that playing for the rest of the season if the team is complete shit. Round 4 goes to Kyle Pitts. Round 5, the worst selection, and round 5 was the better of the fantasy. Well, not really. I mean, look, you've got Marquise Brown, who was disappointing for Joe, of course, because he got injured. But up until that point, he was producing like Hollywood Brown. You had A.J. Dillon for Eric, and I think Eric anticipated A.J. Dillon to be a stronger back. Instead, he's just been a single-digit performance guy, even though he's gotten a few good performances over the past week. But I decided to give this to DJ Moore because DJ Moore has shown potential in fantasy in the past. A lot of big playability. Somebody who's kind of similar, I guess, to a Gabe Davis, or Gabe Davis is similar to him. But the Carolina Panthers offense just hasn't been enough there. A couple double-digit performances, but for the most part, it's been about 20 yards. It's been about 30, 40 yards here and there. DJ Moore is the biggest disappointment of the 5th round in the fantasy season. Darren Waller, of course, having injuries with J-Ray. That selection of DJ Moore was, of course, made by La Bamba. Round 6 is a who's who of terrible decisions. It's like the dream team of horrible teams. I'm just going to read you off every selection, all 10 selections in round 6. Lamar Jackson, Terry McLaurin, good selection for Paul. Jalen Hurts, good selection for Eric. Jerry Jeudy for Joe. Michael Thomas for Spider-Man. Gabe Davis for Charles Lee J. Ray. Deontay Johnson for La Bamba. Darnell Mooney for Plathanos, Kyler Murray for Acknowledge Me, and Chris Godwin for Team Bundy. Kyler Murray had a decent fantasy year. He had a decent fantasy year, but I don't think Kyler Murray is the Kyler Murray of old. If he is drafted next season, I think he'll be drafted much later in the double-digit rounds, but he by no means was the worst selection in this. I mean, where do we start? Darnell Mooney was a complete and utter failure for Hensel. I, of course, wanted Darnell Mooney. Deontay Johnson and the Pittsburgh offense suffered immensely. I think they have a young, Pickens, the name of the rookie quarterback. He's an okay quarterback, but as far as fantasy, he doesn't do you any favors. Deontay Johnson hasn't caught over 10 passes yet this season. He hasn't gotten over 100 yards this season. He hasn't gotten double-digit points this season, but he is not the worst player. I mean, it's even hard to select the worst player because, when you go to Michael Thomas, this is again what I had mentioned earlier. I said injuries aren't really a factor, but when there's a player that has a history of injuries, then you asked for it. And Orlando asked for it. 17 points week 1, 12 points week 2, 4 points, and then he got injured. So Michael Thomas does what Michael Thomas does. So is that really a disappointment? Is it? I don't know. Maybe you should ask the commish. Jerry Jeudy was definitely a disappointment for Joe. Though a disappointment for Joe is like, you know, you really have to take it into consideration, because how much of a disappointment is it when the fantasy owner themselves don't acknowledge the disappointment? If you don't know that you're being lampooned, if you don't know that you're the butt of the joke, is there really a joke? Are you the joke? Is Joe the worst selection in life in the 6th round of the fantasy of the fantasy draft? Is that what we're getting to? Is it not really about Jerry Jeudy and it's really about Joe? I don't know, but it's a disappointing selection nonetheless. And I think it's arguable. You can arguably say that Lamar Jackson was a disappointing selection for Andy, because look, it's the 6th round. At this point, I had already selected Josh Allen in the 3rd round. Then after that, let's see. I just want to see what number quarterback he was off the board. Second off the board, again in the 3rd round, was Jay with Justin Herbert, who was kind of mid this year. He wasn't the Justin Herbert that Jay expected him to be, which is why Jay didn't make the playoffs. So let's see. So I think that's 2. Then Hensel selects Patrick Mahomes in round 5, and then Lamar Jackson is the selection by Andy. So he's the 4th quarterback off the board. Was this a disappointing season for Lamar Jackson? Yes, it was. Lamar Jackson did not put up those monster games that you expect him to get, that he got weeks 2 and 3. That helped Andy out immensely, I'm sure. But after that, it was like 12, 13, 15, 9. Wasn't a great year for Lamar Jackson. So after reading off the entire round 6, we might give this to Deontay Johnson. We might give it to him because just when you click on his name and you just see the targets, the anemic yardage, and the anemic scores to match, he might as well go ahead and take that one. Jerry Jeudy makes an argument for himself though. Round 7. I got to give this to Team Bundy. Kareem Hunt is without a doubt the most disappointing selection of round 7. Kareem Hunt is frustrating to watch. He's kind of always been the back that always falls forward. It's kind of hard for me to describe, but I think some of you understand what I mean. Kareem Hunt, when he gets yardage, it's not very smooth. He doesn't seem like he's based and rooted with a strong set of legs. He's always falling forward or tripping, or it looks like he's accidentally getting yardage. That's always frustrating. And now, as he's moving into the twilight of his career, possibly, he looks even more sloppy and even more doofy. And the fact that they're not throwing any passes to him makes it even worse. I mean, since week 1, 24 yards, 16, 14. These are passing yards now. You would expect Kareem Hunt to at least, get you some 50-yard performances, get you 5 points, and then maybe he walks in there with a touchdown and he's got 30 extra rushing yards because maybe he got 7 carries. That's a possibility to do with Nick Chubb, who was the number 1 running back earlier in the season, but he kind of fell off after that because Andy's just a terrible person. Nick Chubb looked at himself in the mirror. He said, is this what I'm going to do for this year? Am I really going to support Andy? Winning for Andy is kind of like winning for Hitler. So you have to look at yourself in the mirror if you're somebody like Nick Chubb. It has to happen. But Kareem Hunt didn't get any passes. You may say that has something to do with Watson, but it's disappointing for me. I started him last week. He got a 0, which is special. Right? That's really special. He was able to score 1 point at the very least several times this season. That was his low. Week 6, he got 1. Week 10, he got 1. Week 12, he got 1. He couldn't even give me 1 fucking point. 6 rushing yards and 6 passing yards. Motherfucker. He is the most disappointing player. Who else was here for the... Let's see. I mean, Russell Wilson for for Soup Biter Man. Though, you know, I'll argue that with Orlando's pickup of Geno Smith, he was able to rectify that. So even though it was a dud, it was a quarterback, you know, the 5th off the board. And we all thought that he was going to have a pretty good season. We didn't think it would be this worse. I mean, Russell Wilson hasn't even been as consistent as Aaron Rodgers. If you take a look at Aaron Rodgers' stat sheet, it's like a bunch of 16. It's a bunch of 16s. You know what I'm saying? A bunch of bars. It's just a bunch of 16s and maybe a couple 20s or something like that. Russell Wilson's stat sheet is a lot worse. I don't know if any of you have noticed how Russell Wilson has become a meme since the season's kind of tanked, because he's doing the whole Broncos, let's ride. There's this one really depressing one that he says at the end of a press conference. It's probably after like their 4th loss this season. You know, he says what he needs to say to the media, and then he walks away from the podium and he goes, Broncos. And he goes, let's ride. You gotta hear it. You see the caption at the bottom. It requires a caption in order for you to understand what he said. So a disappointing season for Russell Wilson, but Orlando's able to shift that. Clyde Edwards-Helaire injured for Joe picking him up with the 7th pick. So, I mean, with the 7th pick within that round. As far as, I apologize, I haven't been reading off the overall selections. I guess really who gives a shit about that? But yeah, you get the point. Damian Harris also an injury, and another disappointing one was Eric with Brandon Cooks, No, Brandon Cooks actually had pretty much a Brandon Cooks year. That's I don't know. It's hard to tell with the Texans. I don't want any players in the Texans. Fuck you, Dameon Pierce. Fuck you, Ed. Moving on to round 8. We have the worst selection in Aaron Rodgers. It's pretty simple. We've told you about this before. Pedro was able to still make the playoffs with Aaron Rodgers not being the Aaron Rodgers of old, but it's a quarterback. You can bounce back from that. It's the safest form of draft dud. You know, you can recover from that. It's very hard to recover from a running back, especially when you select him with your very first pick. A list of anyone else here? No, this was a very solid fantasy selections for everyone all around. You know, some people with injuries, some people who, you know, maybe towards the end of the season they weren't as special as they once were at the beginning, but good selections overall. Moving on to round 9, we have Tom Brady. And Tom Brady is the worst pick because Ed selected him as his backup. Tom Brady hasn't been started by Ed this year. He's just sat on his bench and he's done absolutely fucking nothing. In week 6 till this point, he hasn't gotten over 20 points. His connection with Mike Evans has dissipated. I don't know what's wrong with the Tampa Bay offense. They have no fantasy value. There is real world value to their offense, but their fantasy value is dwindling. In my opinion, he is the dud because at the very least, I think Ed thought that he had a trade commodity. He had someone that he could at least negotiate with somebody with just in case somebody else needed it, but he was never that. Brady was never Brady, and I think it's officially established that even if he comes back for the 2023 season, no one will draft him. Of course, you can pick him up on your waiver. Maybe Tom Brady can get you 20 points on a bye week, but to draft Tom Brady next year is to really put yourself behind the 8 ball early in the season. Melvin Gordon, of course, being a disappointment for Orlando. He got an injury in week 11. He was just scoring single-digit points. Tony Pollard, phenomenal selection for Hensel. Hensel didn't play him as much as he probably should have played him. But along with Tom Brady, I think Chase Edmonds would be another disappointment for Eric, as Chase Edmonds just nothing. It's just been famine. Yeah, nothing but starvation. And the final draft dud of the 2022 draft goes to none other than Rollo Tomassi with his 92nd selection overall of Drake London. who is a wide receiver who, along with a Kyle Pitts, is supposed to be the future of the Atlanta Falcons offense. It doesn't look like there's any future here. It looks like it's all death. It's cemeteries, it's zombies, it's blood, it's guts, it's gore, and it's no scoring. It's single-digit receptions. It's under 100 yards. It's much like the other duds. He hasn't done much in this fantasy season. Paul, I believe, maybe stashed him on his bench. Does Paul still have... Let's see. Does Paul still have Drake London? Yes, he still has Drake London. He just left him there. I guess he considers him to have enough value, or I don't know, he's got enough room where he can move other positions around. But that is no doubt the worst selection, along with Andy's Rashad Penny. That's also a selection that was, basically didn't materialize, didn't turn into anything. But I'll say Drake London because he's a young player and you expected more from him. Rashad Penny's really somebody that's, you've heard his name within fantasy, but he's never really done much. You understand what I'm saying? Those are your draft duds. Marriage.